What is consciousness? It's one of the most baffling questions in all of philosophy, but maybe it's the wrong question altogether. Sometimes, in order to better understand a strange or complex phenomenon, it's better to shift the question not from what it is, but to why does it even exist? Take this tool, for example. It is a long brass pole with a small nozzle on one end and a curved hook on the other. But that doesn't really give us much insight as to what it truly is. Now ask why it exists, and suddenly it all becomes a lot clearer. Before the age of electricity, this tool was used by lamplighters to light street lamps, and to close up those little doors and extinguish the flames at dawn. In a world without electric lights, it was a vital part of keeping our cities safe after dark. So what about consciousness? Instead of asking what it is in abstract terms, perhaps we should first start by asking, why did it even evolve in the first place? What is the function that it served? What kind of evolutionary edge did it grant us in this unforgiving struggle for survival? Surely consciousness must have offered some advantage to our early ancestors. And how far back do we actually need to go in order to find those first forms of consciousness? At what point did this trait first emerge? Today, we'll be exploring the evolutionary history of consciousness, from Sphexishness to the latest developments in AI research and cognitive science. In this episode, we won't be trying to answer what consciousness is, but rather why it even emerged in the first place. Okay, so I know that I just said that we weren't going to be asking what consciousness is, but we do actually need to come up with some working definition. Otherwise, what are we even doing here? Maybe the better place to start would be with what consciousness is not. Clearly, this pen isn't conscious, and neither is this microphone. But what about a plant? Or a bug? How about a jellyfish? Where exactly do we draw that line? It's tempting to look for a clean divide. Conscious on that side, not conscious on that. But the truth is, there is no sharp boundary. Consciousness, whatever it is, probably emerged gradually, like vision or flight, not all at once. And that's why we start here. Not with consciousness as we experience it today, full of emotion and imagination, but with something much simpler, a world of routine, reflexes, and reactions. A world before learning, before internal models, before awareness. A world of creatures that behave in ways that look intelligent, but aren't. Creatures like the Sphex wasp. When the Sphex wasp brings a fresh catch to its nest, it will drop the paralyzed insect right in front of its burrow. Then, the wasp goes in to check if everything's okay, that there aren't any predators, no dangers lurking inside. Only then will it come back out before dragging its prey inside. From the outside, this looks like a remarkably intelligent, premeditated sequence of actions. It's methodical, precise, surgical almost. But here's where things get weird. If you wait for the wasp to venture into its burrow, and then move the prey by just a few centimeters, the wasp will come out, find its prey slightly out of place, and instead of just dragging it straight in, it'll repeat its routine all over again. The wasp drags its prey to the door, ventures in, checks the burrow, comes back out, prey's moved again, start over. You see, you can repeat this action of moving the catch away from the entrance as soon as the wasp enters its burrow, and every single time it will come back out and repeat its little routine, over and over again. In a way, the wasp is stuck in a behavioral loop, not because the organism is broken, but because it is following a rigid, pre-programmed set of behaviors. It has no memory of its previous sequence of behaviors, no awareness that anything has changed. It is not learning how to adapt its behavior over time. This is what scientists call Sphexishness, a sort of genetic fixity, an incapacity to react to a given situation in any flexible manner. And it's not just Sphex wasps, of course. I mean, we too can enter behavioral loops that we can find ourselves unable to escape. A smoker might find themselves suddenly compelled to light a cigarette every time the bell rings to sound their work break. The difference between the wasp and ourselves, however, is that our awareness grants us, at least in theory, the capacity to adapt our behavior to some extent. This might be our very first insight towards understanding the evolutionary history of consciousness. If the wasp wanted to adapt its behavior, it would have to wait until a successive generation of Sphex was born that somehow had the capacity to remember whether it had checked the burrow or not. This newer model would enter the burrow, check that everything was okay, come out to see the cricket now a couple centimeters away, but go ahead and drag it in anyway, because now it remembers that it's already checked the burrow. The wasp's behavior has adapted, but it took it a whole generation to do so. And so perhaps consciousness first emerged as a means for organisms to adapt their behavior, not from one generation to the next, but within the timeframes of a single organism's own lifetime. This is the working definition that we shall be using today. Consciousness as a tool for learning. 540 million years ago, the Earth was teeming with much simpler creatures. They didn't plan, they didn't learn, they just followed scripts, much like our Sphex wasp. These creatures didn't need to know anything about the world, they just reacted to it. But all of that began to change the moment they started eating each other. Imagine you're a fish, swimming around in the dim, ancient ocean. In the distance you spot a faint, flickering light. Your instincts nudge you towards it. This is a positive valence stimulus. Your nervous system doesn't know what it is, but it's been wired to treat light as something that is good. Maybe it's food, maybe it's shelter. But as you approach, snap, a monstrous mouth bursts from the darkness. You've just been swallowed whole by an anglerfish, a predator that has hijacked your reward system for its own personal gain. Now, imagine another fish, one that managed to swerve away at the very last second. It survives, and maybe it remembers, perhaps not explicitly like we might, but in a crude, neural way. Following this encounter, the positive valence that it once had towards light may have dropped a little. That flickering light, it might not feel quite as positive anymore. This is the beginning of reinforcement learning, the idea that organisms can change the way they act, not just based on hard-coded instincts, but based on what happens to them, on experience, on trial and error. Pain, pleasure, safety, hunger, fear. Suddenly these begin to shape an organism's behavior in ways that go beyond the script. It is this ability to continuously modulate the valence of emotional stimuli, which underlies our need for consciousness. In other words, once survival depends on adjusting your inner compass of good and bad to fit the ever-shifting circumstances of the world, then some form of awareness becomes necessary. And that changes everything. Because now it isn't enough just to react to the world, you also have to anticipate it. You have to make predictions, to remember what worked last time and what didn't, to build expectations, to simulate outcomes before they even happen. In other words, you need to generate a model of the world. And around 540 million years ago, these ancient organisms may have started doing just that. Over the next 20 million years, life on Earth exploded in diversity. This is what we now call the Cambrian Explosion, and it may well mark the moment where life first began to model the world around it. To simulate, to learn, to know, in the faintest, earliest sense of the term. And maybe that is where the story of consciousness really begins. The Cambrian Explosion wasn't just a burst of bodies, it was a burst of brains. In this arms race of evolution, vision sharpened, reflexes quickened, and bodies became more complex. But something even more profound was happening behind the eyes. Nervous systems were evolving, growing more sophisticated, more centralized, more capable of integration and control. Simple reflexes weren't enough anymore. You couldn't just react to the world. You had to anticipate. The cost of being wrong was death. So organisms began to build internal maps of their world. Spatial maps, temporal maps. Maps not just of where things are, but of when they tended to happen. Suddenly, memories and prediction weren't just luxuries anymore. They were tools for survival. At the turn of the 20th century, psychologist Edward Thorndike demonstrated just how powerful this type of learning could be. He placed hungry cats inside puzzle boxes, simple wooden enclosures with levers or latches that would open a door to both freedom and food. At first, the cats would thrash around blindly, but eventually they might bump into the mechanism at random, accidentally opening the door. Over time, they started getting faster, more efficient, and the trial and error flailing gave way to goal-directed behavior. The cat wasn't just reacting anymore. It had learned which sequence of actions was most likely to lead to reward. It had formed an internal association between cause and effect, between stimulus and consequence. In other words, it had begun to build a behavioral map, a simulation of possible actions and their likely outcomes, and to weigh those outcomes based on their valence, learning which path to pursue based on which gave the best possible outcome. Thorndike called this the law of effect. Behaviors that were followed by satisfying outcomes were more likely to be repeated in the future. But really, what's happening here is that the organism is predicting which actions are worth pursuing. It is simulating possible futures and letting experience shape those expectations over time. And that marked a turning point, because now an organism wasn't just living in the present, it was simulating, rehearsing, projecting. Instead of relying solely on hardwired instincts, it could now run models, silent internal rehearsals of the world, and make decisions based on those imagined futures, not just past instincts. In the words of Alfred North Whitehead, the purpose of thinking is to let the ideas die instead of us. This is where some neuroscientists believe the seeds of consciousness began to take root, not just as a spotlight for real-time awareness, but as a stage for mental time travel. Because a model doesn't just reflect what is, it lets you explore what could be. What if I go left instead of right? What if I approach that shadow? What if I don't? To do this well, you need more than just sensory input. You need emotion. You need a compass, a way to weigh different outcomes based on their valence. Pain, pleasure, fear, hope. These aren't distractions from rationality. They are how the model generator learns to evaluate what matters the most. And when the model runs without any input at all, well, that's dreaming. A fully untethered simulation, run for free, while your body sleeps. Whenever you dream, you are doing so consciously. Your mind is simulating imagined futures and evaluating the valences of those different possible outcomes. The world goes dark, but the mind keeps practicing. So perhaps consciousness didn't evolve to help us see the world more clearly, but to better predict how it might unfold next. To run simulations, to test scenarios, to evaluate outcomes before we acted on them. But there still seems to be one crucial element that we've missed out here, because in order to truly simulate a future, you don't just need a model of the world, you need a model of yourself within it. Your needs, your abilities, your limitations, a sense of what you are and what you are capable of doing. Without that, there is no prediction, only fantasy. Without that, the simulation has no anchor, and that changes everything. Because once an organism can simulate itself, it can begin to reflect, to evaluate not just outcomes, but intentions, to imagine not just what will happen, but what it might choose to do. In a sense, to become self-aware. When an organism starts modeling the world, it doesn't take long before it starts modeling others within it too. Because it isn't enough to predict how the world itself might unfold, since oftentimes the most unpredictable elements of all are the very agents living inside it. Other organisms that move, compete, cooperate and deceive. Organisms that are also modeling the world, and that might even be modeling you. Suddenly, survival isn't just about understanding the physical world, it's about understanding social worlds. Who knows what, who intends to do what, and who can be trusted. So the inner simulator, once used to map space and anticipate outcomes, now turns towards more abstract territory. It starts generating models not just of rocks and trees, but of minds themselves. And this ability to simulate the invisible mental states of others is what psychologists refer to as theory of mind. Not just what is true, but what they believe to be true. In a sense, the mind is simulating other minds simulating. A hall of mirrors where each reflection is another layer of prediction. But this ability doesn't appear all at once. In young children, for example, it only begins to emerge around the age of 4 or 5. Developmental psychologists often test this with the false belief task, sometimes called the Sally Ann test. A child watches as one person hides a toy, then leaves the room. Another person then moves the toy to a different spot. When the first person returns, very young children will insist that they will look in the new spot, as if everybody must know what they themselves know. Only later do children realize that minds can hold different beliefs from their own, and that predicting behavior means tracking not just the world as it is, but also the world as others see it. But recognizing that others have different beliefs is only the beginning. To truly simulate them, you need more than just the awareness that minds can diverge. You need some internal model of what a mind even is, how thoughts form, how emotions influence decisions, how beliefs guide actions. And the only mind that you have direct access to is your own. Turning inward then becomes the next step. But turning inward is no small achievement. For an infant pressed against its mother's skin, there is no direct awareness of a boundary between me and not me. Only slowly, through experience, do organisms learn to map the edges of their bodies, to distinguish between inner sensation and external events. Self-modeling, in this sense, is not given. It must be built, just like the model of the outside world. So you begin to reflect inward, and in doing so, you don't just model yourself. You start becoming better at predicting yourself. Now, on a quick side note, the notion of selfhood isn't actually necessary for consciousness at all. There are certain mental states, like ones reached through meditation practices like vipassana, where the notion of selfhood dissolves entirely. Awareness remains, but the feeling of being a separate I fades away. A creature can be aware, can feel, can even dream without experiencing an identity. However, once self-awareness emerges, it does offer some key advantages. Because now you can use your own experience as a template. How would I have acted in that situation? How would I feel in their place? This introspective shortcut allows you to predict others more efficiently by projecting your own mental states into theirs. Self-awareness, in this sense, is not just about knowing yourself. It's about better understanding everyone else. What do I believe? What do I want? What do they think I want? From the outside in and the inside out, a loop begins to form. The social mirror turns inward, and what reflects is a self. Not as a fixed identity, but as an ongoing simulation. A story that we tell ourselves, constantly updated in response to the world around us, and the minds within. Not because nature found truth, but because nature needed strategy. A model sharp enough to outwit, to empathize, to belong. The I was never a goal. It was only a tool. So, what have we learned? Well, we saw that life first began with rigid routines. Creatures like the Sphex wasp acted as if on autopilot, following genetically hardwired scripts. The first sparks of consciousness, it seems, emerged as a way to break free from these rigid loops, allowing organisms to adapt their behaviors within their own lifetimes. Reinforcement learning, modulating action based on experience, created the need for an inner awareness. Then, we explored how the complexity of the Cambrian world demanded more than just reflexes. Organisms developed internal simulations, mental maps, memory, and prediction. Consciousness began to function as a virtual reality of the world, letting creatures anticipate outcomes, plan actions, and navigate danger and opportunity before it arrived. Lastly, we saw the leap to subjective experience. Once organisms could simulate the world internally, they also began to model themselves within it. The conscious awareness of one's own self became a way to better predict the behavior of others, but also of one's own. Emotions and pleasure-pain signals were no longer just reactions. They were part of a narrative that helped guide our actions within this inner world. Together, these stages suggest that consciousness evolved as a tool for survival, to model the world, to test actions before executing them, and to steer lives towards more favorable outcomes. It was an engine for adaptation, embedded within our biology. But there's still one puzzle left unsolved, because for all this modeling, for all this simulating, there still remains the undeniable fact that it feels like something to be the one doing it. That there is an inner light switched on, a perspective from which the world and the self are revealed. This what it is like to be-ness is the real mystery of consciousness. Because while asking why consciousness emerged might offer some few key insights, ultimately the question that we want to be asking is, what does it even mean? This is something that I want to continue exploring in future videos. So if you like this sort of content, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.